I did that slideshow because it's hard for me to tell this story, like the full story. So when it comes to my grandmother's estate and the reason why I believe I was supposed to inherit the estate, you have to look at past history. So it's not what's happening today that is the reason why my grandmother and the reason why my sister inherited my grandmother's estate. The reason that happened is how I explained it. So one of the things I didn't tell y'all is that prior to my mother's death, when she lived with me in Tennessee, she was extremely sick. She was very sick. And one time she ended up in the hospital. Well, she ended up in the hospital a few times. But this particular time, I was on military duty with the National Guard. And I got called from my duties with the National Guard to come home because my mother was in the hospital, deathly ill. When my mother basically came to, she told me something that, I was in tears. And she was in tears telling me this. So basically what happened is, when I lived in Tennessee, I wasn't making that much money. I was an E4 in the National Guard. I worked and I was in the National Guard. So I basically had two jobs, National Guard, and I was working as a security officer. I didn't make much money. I wish I could have, but there was a lot of things that I couldn't do outside of just paying the bills at that time. And with my mother living with me, my bills was kind of double, basically, because I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment with my mother. The light bill was high, extremely high. The only thing I didn't have to worry about was food. But I say that to tell you this. I had a brother who also lived in Tennessee, 30 minutes away from where I lived. Now, I'm not saying that he was responsible for doing other things for my mom, and that other thing would have been getting my mother a cell phone, at least a cheap track phone. My brother didn't want to do that. He wanted me to buy the cell phone for my mother, which I didn't have the money. Now, mind you, I have 3 siblings. My oldest brother, Dennis, didn't even want to help my mother at all. My sister, she was too doped out to help my mother. She was always drunk and doped out. She didn't have nothing of her own because she was on welfare with her kids. So, that's part of the problem. However, here's the biggest problem. When my mother went to the hospital, my mother was in our apartment for 3 days. For 3 days by herself. Now, mind you, my mother had got sick and I had to take her to the hospital before, and she ended up staying in the hospital. Prior to me going on this mission with the National Guard, I continued to tell my older brother, hey, make sure you check on mama every day while I'm gone. I was supposed to be gone for 2 weeks, but it ended up being close to 2 months. But I was telling my brother, hey, make sure you check on my mama every day. He didn't do it. He didn't check on my mother every day at all. So it's like, now, I end up being on this mission with the military for 2 months. My mother, now he was checking on her, but not every day like he was supposed to. My mother tells me, she ended up, we had a 2-bedroom apartment. She ended up crawling from her bedroom to our living room, which is a good distance, to unlock the door to make sure that my brother could get in when he finally came. She also told me that she crawled on the couch that we had. On the, where the couch was situated was a wall that was connected to a neighbor. She banged on that wall 3 days straight, as hard as she could. But she couldn't bang on it hard because she had no energy. She banged on the wall for 3 days straight, and this man couldn't answer because he didn't hear the bangs. She said that she slept on that couch, she urinated on it, and had to poop on it because she couldn't get up to go to the restroom. For 3 days. For 3 days. When my older brother finally came, he got her, they picked her up, they took her to the hospital. And when they took her to the hospital, they left her there by herself. When I was called by the military and I finally was able to come to my mother's bedside, nobody was in the hospital. And this was at night. Nobody was in the hospital with my mother at the time that she needed them. Nobody. Until I came. My mother was extremely hurt behind that. She was extremely hurt behind that. So you have to understand, if you go back and read the slides that I was telling you, you have to think about this. Prior to her death, my mother died with a feeling of not having any family that cared for her. You understand that? She had, you know, when I was younger, I used to always see my family members taking advantage of my mom. Like, my mom was on welfare, and she was on public assistance. She used to get her VASH housing. She used to get vouchers for rent, and then she'll pay the rest. My cousins, brothers, and all them used to come move with my mother and not help her with rent at all. So this is my strong belief that when my grandmother informed my mother that she was gonna pass the house down to her, my mother verbally willed the house off to me by telling me everything. Now it's 2024. Right now, the house that my mother would have got, that my grandmother willed off to my sister, well, my sister doesn't own it. Why? Because my sister doesn't know the details that my mother told me. See, at the end of the day, my mother was my grandmother's caretaker. You understand? My mother took care of my grandmother. So my grandmother wanted to will her house off to my mother. But my mother passed away before my grandmother. So my grandmother hastily willed the house off to my sister. You understand that? It's confusing, right? It's confusing for me too. But that's how it went. That's the story. Thank y'all for listening. I appreciate y'all. Have a good one.